Good afternoon. It's an unusual opening for a CAP event. Welcome to the Center for American Progress Action Fund. My name is Neera Tandon. I'm really excited to welcome you here. I'm the president of CAP Action and the Center for American Progress. It's my great honor to introduce Steve Phillips, a civil rights lawyer, an author, a political leader, and really most important, a CAP Senior Fellow. For nearly 30 years, Steve has been a leader on social justice issues ranging from education reform to exposing racial discrimination in cities and corporations. He was the youngest person ever elected to the public office in San Francisco and went on to become the president of the Board of Education. As co-founder of PowerPack.org, a political and social justice organization, Steve has done critical work in conducting independent voter mobilization efforts. We are particularly excited to have Steve with us today as he officially releases his new book, Brown is the New White: How the Demographic Revolution Has Created a New American Majority. This book explains how progressive whites and progressives of color add up to a new American majority of eligible voters. Steve argues that it's time to rethink how resources are used in order to meet the challenge of turning this majority into real progressive victories. As we head into the 2016 presidential election, this book serves as an important call to action for progressives like us and everyone in this room to engage and empower communities of color. It really could not come at a more interesting time for this discussion. Joining Steve for an in-depth conversation in his book is Maria Teresa Kumar, another impressive leader and influencer. Maria Teresa is the founding president and CEO of Voto Latino and an Emmy-nominated contributor with MSNBC, where she hosts a web show called Changing America. Please join me in welcoming Steve Phillips and Maria Teresa Kumar to the stage for a great discussion.
So, Steve, before I get started, I have to say that you have a group of groupies that follow you around. You are from the West Coast, and you immediately walk in and everybody starts applauding. What's your magic?
Well, no, it's very exciting to be here, and I'm really pleased that CAP is hosting this event, and this has been I've been doing this work for a long time, so perhaps that's it, that I'm kind of old at this point, but there's a lot of us who've been trying to make the country better, who've been dealing with social justice issues, who've been trying to bring the country's politics to embrace the increasing diversity and to see that represents a new path forward. And we fought a lot of battles over the years, from the Rainbow Days, the Free South Africa movement, the campaigns in the 90s. And so where we're at now is that all of those efforts and all those communities have reached this transformative point where we're actually the majority of people in the country, and now we're trying to go around the country and spread that message.
And they all started here with CAP. So I want to thank CAP for having us. And I think that what Neera said is absolutely right. We are having it's important to have this conversation given, first of all, what we just saw in Iowa and how we keep hearing of the demographic shifts. And one conversation that you and I were having was that some folks say that President Obama was an anomaly, even though I like to stress that he was voted in twice. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so I think that particularly the re-election was one of the most important pieces that people don't realize, that a lot of people kind of got caught up potentially. You could even make that argument in 2008, but after 4 years of sustained attack, there were actually 5 million fewer white voters who voted for Obama. And so what that coalition represents, and that really is the percentages that I use to be able to look at what this new American majority represents, is that 80% of people of color, 39% of whites is 51% of the population. And that can stand behind things like universal health care and fair pay for women and marriage equality. That's a progressive, inspiring agenda that there is majority support for. And I think Obama's elections prove that. Although, unfortunately, not everybody within the progressive movement has grasped that message and is still not moving forward as affirmatively and enthusiastically as we should.
Why is that?
Well, I think it's when you've been doing things for a long time, it's hard to shift. And the reason that we call this book Brown is the New White, because for so long, politics has been about chasing the voters in the center, which is really the white swing voters. I'm talking about the tyranny of the white swing voter. But the country's population of color has grown so large that people of color can provide the cornerstones for a new American majority. And so that's what we mean, but we have to start with people of color's interest instead of and actually there's a piece in the Times today saying that politics has always been about addressing the fears, concerns, and anxieties of middle-class whites,
right.
which is true, but that is not the way to move forward. And that's the debate that we have to have right now around what direction are we going to go.
Well, and I think just to cement a little bit of what you're saying, most folks don't realize that 50% of the population growth between 2000 and 2010 were children of immigrants that happened to be Latino. And when you start looking at that kind of explosion that's literally right, behind our shoulder, if we're not building the infrastructures, and this is what I understand you're saying, if we're not building the infrastructures to promote the issues that we care about, and we're not inviting them to the table, then there may not be a progressive movement. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yes, and this is the point about trying to make this a wake-up call to the progressive movement. The progressive side spent $2.7 billion on the election in 2012. And so if 46% of the voters are people of color, is almost half the money going to be going into those different communities? Or are we going to be spending it on TV ads that are trying to chase the shrinking sector of the electorate that's the white swing voter?
Well, not even the white swing voter. You're talking about a very specific. If you're spending most of your money on television ads, you're actually talking about an older white swing voter because you're not even inviting white millennials into the conversation.
Right. Yeah. So in North Carolina, for instance, in 2014, the progressive side spent $19 million in negative television ads trying to defeat Tom Tillis and that.
That's really inspiring.
Yes, right. So you can't argue that negative television ads are a way to actually increase turnout.
Right.
The whole theory of that case is that we're going to focus on this narrow sector and try to change their minds. They could have taken that money and hired 400 full-time staffers to go door to door for an entire year. And if they had just gotten, each of those persons had gotten 3 additional voters each week, Kay Hagan would have won that race.
So I hear you're saying that you have to redistribute how campaigns fund the elections and to whom that money goes to. Right now, we're guesstimating that in 2016, we're talking about a $6 billion election. And where, if you look at how much money was spent during the 2012 elections when it came just to Latino voters on the national level, we're talking about less than $20 million went into what is considered the second largest demographic of Americans. How can we start changing that demographic? I mean, 20 million when you said 2.5 billion was spent, that's not even a drop in the bucket. That's not even 1%. So how do we start changing the conversation so that folks feel like they are welcomed in sharing power? Because I think that's also fundamentally what oftentimes these conversations lead into, is like, who is sharing power and how do you do that?
Yeah, well, I think this has to be a grassroots effort to hold people accountable. And so I really think there needs to be it's a call to arms of activists to hold campaigns accountable. And so that's where I've tried to create a tool to be able to ask different questions. So every campaign should be asked, do you have a plan? What is your path to getting a majority of the voters, and how many voters of color do you need? Does your budget match that plan? And are you evaluating on a regular basis the progress of that? So little of politics is transparent or accountable. But now we have tools to be able to do that. People have to file campaign reports. Everybody can have a Twitter account to be able to send out information. And so we can, as a grassroots level, put pressure on the campaigns to be more transparent, more accountable, and then force them to answer the questions. How are they spending that money? Is it going into the communities? Are they hiring staff from the communities, partnering with community organizations?
Well, and let's delve a little deeper. You're part of your argument saying is that it's not enough just to spend into those communities of color, but it's also very important to hire individuals that actually reflect. So you're changing the culture so that basically campaigns, and I know it's not your quote, but basically it's so that the campaigns are not hiring smart-ass white guys. Correct? I mean, that's what you said, that you reiterated from that was borrowed.
The technical title of the chapter is Fewer Smart-Ass White Boys.
Well, by demographics, yes. That's naturally happening. So what's your...
But it really is, if we're going to win elections, we have to have deep competence and understanding and knowledge of the communities that we're actually reaching out to. So I talk about in the book about the example in Orange County, Rita Hamida, Arab American activist. She went to the voter file people and asked for a list of Arab American voters. They gave her a list of 5,000 people. She says, let me go into the database and see. And so she goes to look at all the countries of Arab origin, all the different aspects of ways to identify who is Arab, but who may not be captured in the census form. She found 50,000 people. And then they did a voter program that contacted people, called people. They moved people in the race. Bao Nguyen's run, the Vietnamese who ran for mayor of Garden Grove, won by 12 votes. And so that's an example of having a level of cultural competence that is not necessarily reflected in terms of who is currently running campaigns.
Because you're basically arguing that by not doing so, you're actually leaving votes on the table.
46% of Obama's voters are people of color, right? And then the other example was I don't think people appreciate the cultural skill set that was required to navigate the whole controversy around the whole Reverend Wright strategy, right? To be able to validate African Americans who did not actually find that whole situation to be particularly unfamiliar in terms of a minister making a criticism of the country, but also be able to speak to the fears and concerns of whites and then bring it all together. That required somebody who came out of those communities and interestingly, that was the speech that Obama wrote himself. He didn't actually turn to the staffers. So to be effective in a multiracial society that has a history of racism and a contemporary reality of racial division and racial disparities, you have to have great cultural competence.
So Obama, because he was a person of color, as you said, he was able to provide that extra lens as a candidate. Oftentimes, you could say that culture change starts at the top, whether you're talking about political campaigns or whether you're talking about CEOs and best practices within the workforce. What advice do you give, besides the two things that you shared? What advice do you give to someone like Hillary Clinton, who is so seasoned when it comes to running political campaigns, that maybe make her a little bit off the mark if she's not incorporating them? She may understand, but if she's not incorporating, what advice do you give her?
Well, the first advice I would give both to Hillary and Bernie is to desegregate the office of vice presidency. And we've never had a person of color who have been the vice president, and never had a person of color as the candidate. And so if we're going to without Obama at the top of the ticket to inspire people, that some of the talented people of color who are positioned to be in leadership should be looked to for that position, right? Cory Booker and Castro on the Hillary side, Nina Turner on Bernie's side, right? And so these people should be in the conversation, and ultimately one of them needs to be on the ticket.
Have you had that conversation with either Hillary or Bernie?
Let's see if Hillary's cold.
He makes it sound like she hasn't. So in writing this book, and you're having these conversations with a lot of your own white progressive friends, how have they received it?
So a lot of people are very excited. Some are here wearing the T-shirt with the book here. I think that what's interesting is that, I often say that a lot of times the white progressives are like the Rodney Dangerfield of politics, so that they don't get any respect. And there's so much attention to Democrats aren't getting enough support of white working class people, and what are we actually going to do about that? But there has always been, throughout the history of this country, a meaningful minority of whites who have stood for justice, who have sided for equality, who have partnered with people of color, from abolitionism to the civil rights movement, to partners of the Black Lives Matter movement. So it's tapping that sentiment and putting people in that tradition and inviting them to be part of building a better country founded on the principles of justice and equality, and partnering up with the communities of color.
So one of the conversations that I recently had was by a white progressive, a really dear friend of mine, a mentor of mine, and she was very hurt. She said, we keep having these conversations on race, but I can't be blamed for being white. And I think with these rises in these conversations, we forget the natural allegiance that we have, and the fact that we are all trying to collectively work towards a bigger, better country. How do we create space, one, to have that conversation, even among our progressive brothers and sisters, one, and how do we start also teaching a lot of the new young leaders within the people of color communities that may not have that legacy?
Well, I think that we have an opportunity in this election to take this on, right? So we talk a lot about inequality, and so we had the whole Occupy Wall Street, the 99% 1%. There's a lot of talk about income inequality in our society, but we have profound wealth gap and wealth inequality, and that's by racial group. And so there's an implicit assumption when we don't take that issue on that people of color are poor because something's wrong with people of color. And that people basically have the amount of money they deserve. And if you're wealthy, it's because you worked hard, and if you're poor, it's because you didn't. But we have to start educating people that the GI Bill and the home loan programs after World War II basically took billions of dollars and gave it to white people and created the middle class in America and excluded explicitly a lot of people of color. And that's a lot of the essence of this issue of the inequality we have. So we can have that conversation, and then people can start to realize that it's not that they're being personally attacked, but they have to appreciate that the inequalities in our society have intentionality to them, that then we need to then work together to tackle that.
Right. And I think that's right. I mean, I think oftentimes folks don't realize that the rise of the middle class was not just the GI Bill, but it was also a lot of soldiers coming back, and they were guaranteed loans, whereas oftentimes African Americans and Latinos were not. They were basically segregated to the projects.
Right. I grew up in Cleveland Heights, Ohio, Dartmoor Road. My parents could not buy our home because they were African American. So I had to go to a white civil rights lawyer, Byron Kranz, to buy the house and then deed it over to our parents. And so, I'm not that old, right? And so in terms of
you're not old at all.
How this has transpired, and so that's an example of. And then I use an example in the book. That home has actually appreciated significantly in value, almost doubled in value since the 70s. My grandparents' home in the city of Cleveland hasn't really grown much in value at all. So that issue around who got access to houses is very tied to who actually has wealth in our society now. So our white allies need to be educated about that and then join with us in a program and a plan to be able to address that.
And so how do we change the current structure when it comes to, one, who do political parties give to? And two, how do we create supporting infrastructure? Because it's not just about party politics at the end of the day.
No, it's not. And so but that is where a lot of the money is. And so that's where an example. So we have to challenge these campaigns to be in partnership with community organizations, right? And a lot of organizations do Souls to the Polls campaigns with churches, right? And so are you going to actually build the relationship with the church leaders? Are you going to put your resources there, send buses, take people, et cetera? So there's a community partnership piece because the campaigns are where a lot of this money exists. But also in terms of we have to be challenging the philanthropic sector and the major donors as well, is to be able to reckon who do you see as the drivers of change and who do you think is most important, and identifying and validating and elevating the talent that's in the communities, but it's not necessarily often on TV.
Right. Well, and I think and what I mean by that, it's not just party politics. The underlying is that oftentimes the goal of investments in communities of color is for the candidate to get just enough votes to win them over the top. But I think you're actually making a stronger argument saying that we actually have to build the infrastructure so that there is a permanent power of voice. So how do you shift that conversation so that folks understand the importance of investing in communities so that after the votes are counted, after the person is elected, we're actually building a mobilization machine similar to what Planned Parenthood has been able to do and capitalize on.
Right. Yeah, and I think we have to educate the donor world as well as the political world, as well as the activist space, because it's on both sides. A lot of times people who do issue advocacy don't see the significance of politics, right? And so
that's hard to believe, but yes, it's true.
Well, we look at Ferguson, right? And so for all of the rage and anger and mobilization that happened in Ferguson after the death of Michael Brown, that's a majority black city. So we have to translate that anger into voter registration and voter mobilization and candidate training so that then we can actually take over the city. So we don't have to march in the streets. We can just fully take control of City Hall and get rid of the people who shouldn't be there and put the right people in place. But we have to make those connections, and I don't think we've done a good enough job of that
Well,
yet.
no, and in Ferguson in 2012, you had 51% of the population participating at the polls when they were electing for president. But when it came to electing their municipality, the mayor that was going to choose the next sheriff and so on and so forth, they had less than 6% participation. Right. So how do we educate the population that politics and policy is local?
Right. Well, it's educating the population and it's educating the funding world as well, right? And so people need to see if you want to fund in the criminal justice space, you want to fund in youth development space, there should be, I would argue that those funds should be directed toward a place like Ferguson to do massive voter registration in that area. And that actually ties those things together. So I think that's another level. I think we have to all kind of speak up and speak out to all the people who are actually in positions of power and influence. The donor world has to be challenged, and they're not, they're very people who actually tell somebody who gives money away that what they're doing is wrong. But I think we have to have that level of accountability around what their strategies are, and are they being accountable, and are they aligning those strategies with the actual trends that have been proven to drive social change?
So you wear multiple hats, including being one of those individuals that give philanthropically. How do we change that mindset? How do you? I mean, that's a culture. I mean, we've known each other for a long time, and I sometimes feel like we have oftentimes these conversations about the demographic shifts that are happening, but we don't see much movement within the donor community.
Well, the first step was to write a book, right? So there was that part.
No, but
right. But
yeah.
I mean, I say that facetiously, but not that there is not a appreciation of what the actual demographics of the country are, and there's certainly not an appreciation that the way to win is to invest in and mobilize people of color. It's still seen as an add-on or something that would be good, and we'll get to it when we get through the other important stuff. But people are saying, well, we want to win. We have to be serious. We have to look at the numbers. And that was really why I wanted to make this book so numerically based, right? And I was like, all right, you want to talk about numbers? I'm going to go get 2 PhDs who are going to do a whole bunch of spreadsheets, and then we'll have some numbers too.
Right.
And I do think, that's part of because people don't believe that that's how you win. And that's the debate that we actually have. If you want to win, it's not a question of this just being a nice thing to do. And that's the evidence of the past 8 years. When voters of color have been mobilized, we have won. And when they have stayed at home, we've lost.
Right.
But that hasn't permeated yet into the minds of people who are funding and running campaigns.
And do you see, because I know, and this is, do you see that right now it's getting increasingly intertwined, the conversations between Hillary's camp and Bernie Sanders' camp? And I say it's less about the campaigns, but the people supporting each. Do you see that as a potential danger when it comes to the 2016 election?
Well, I do think that we're all going to need everybody to win, and so we can't alienate the other campaign, and to the extent that people are actually going to stay home. But I actually think that there's a challenge that we need to put to both of the campaigns to take their effort and their rhetoric another level, right?
And what is that?
So that what has been positive is that they've both been able to articulate the language of Black Lives Matter, utter the words about institutional racism. But these campaigns, the two of them have $200+ million. So why not put together a candidate recruitment and training program to run district attorneys from the communities of color? So we have more district attorneys like Marilyn Mosby in Baltimore and fewer like Tim McGinty in Cleveland, right? And so that would speak directly to the issues people are facing in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement. And so it's going beyond the rhetoric to a specific plan and then putting money where their mouth is.
Well, and I think that's interesting. I think that a lot of the policies one of the reasons that you have such friction right now within Congress is that people realize that Congress became more or less dysfunctional, but they're taking the fights to the state level. And what you're encouraging is sort of the same thing, is basically how do we actually start winning at the state level so that we can create not only policies that we're comfortable with, but also candidates that we're comfortable with and that are diverse.
Yeah. So I think a lot of the intensity of what people feel and experience is at the state level. Certainly where the whole issues of police violence are taking place are in these different communities. And so is there going to be a level of accountability? Are the police going to serve the community? Those are things people experience every day. Right? You see a police car in your rearview mirror, that speaks to you much more than an abstract thing about such and such policy issue. So to have solutions that speak to that issue, that is, I think, going to be an important part. I think it's frankly going to be an important component of increasing turnout of voters of color, is being able to get people to move a specific local policy agenda on that level, and then also to get local communities to take a stand around issues of immigration, around including all of the members of the family who are here within the society without demonizing them or deporting them.
So do you actually believe, though, that the campaigns would reallocate their funds to local races?
Well, I actually think that they need to, I think both of these campaigns are going to be challenged to match the enthusiasm and turnout that we had with Obama. And so in that context, you have to think about what are the issues that are motivating people and that are inspiring, that will be inspiring people to get them to come out. And so I think that in Chicago, where there was a policeman shot somebody 18 times and they tried to cover that up, that if there were a candidate who were running on that issue around having the law enforcement and the district attorney's office be accountable to the community and that person were inspired, I think a lot of people will be excited about that. And Illinois has a Senate seat held by a Republican that's up for election this year. So if you want to get those people to turn out, then this is a chance to, that's just a way to get those voters more excited to participate than just trying to pitch a candidate.
Well, and doing business as usual. One of the things that really stayed with me during the 2014 election was that, first of all, it was the worst voter turnout in our country's history in 72 years. And a lot of folks, disproportionately, folks that weren't participating in this case were Latinos. And people were pulling their hair out because they're saying, well, Latinos are apathetic. And then we had Latinos Decisions did a poll and found out that by the Democratic and Republican Party and third-party organizations, only 41% of previous Latino voters had been contacted. So if you're saying, well, if we're not even contacting the full people that are already participating, what shot do we have of bringing in new voters? Like, how do you marry those two?
Right, and then what is the policy platform that you're running at? Right. So in Colorado, where Udall was running to hold his Senate seat, he would not talk about immigration. He had actually been better in immigration than his opponent, but he wouldn't talk about the issue, and he wouldn't talk about the threat that it posed to the families of Latino families in Colorado. 300,000 Democrats stayed home in Colorado. Just 7,000 Republicans stayed home, and that's how we lost that Senate seat. And so, are the candidates speaking to the pressing concerns in the community? And that, I think, is where there's a lot of the greatest opportunity for growth, is to actually be much more bold. And if we're in an election where it's accepted discussion that we should round up and ship out 11 million people and ban anybody coming here from who's a Muslim, if that's acceptable conversation, then why is it acceptable conversation to say that everybody who is here should get amnesty and should get it now? The immigration history of this country is complicated, that many Native Americans would argue take issue of who is defined as illegal. And so let's just say if you're here, and you're contributing, we'll all be part of the family, and then we'll figure out the rules for future flow from there. But if they're over here in this discussion, why can't we have that conversation on the left side?
Why can't we? What's preventing the
Because the candidates don't yet believe that that's what a majority of the electorate will believe, will be supportive. They think it will alienate the swing voters in the middle. But my proposition, and I think the lesson of the past 8 years, is that actually speaking to those issues and inspiring those communities would move us much more in that direction.
So what do you say to a Republican candidate who basically has not seen any repercussions for the divisive language that they're spouting, and that in fact we actually see buzz of some more senior, older Democratic voters considering voting for one of these populist messages?
So I actually don't. I think there's two issues happening on the Republican side. And it's going to be fascinating to see how it plays itself out. Because on the one hand, you have the doubling or tripling down on the nativist, get rid of all of those people type of approach. But the other, so that's a danger. I don't believe there are enough of the people who will be peeled off that would pose a threat to us if we get our own vote out. I believe there is a solid, consistent core of progressive whites who will be with us. That's what the evidentiary record shows from the exit polls from '76 until now. The other danger is that, because I talk in the book about how the chapter around conservatives can count, and that they have a dual approach of suppression and seduction. And so then the other danger is a Marco Rubio, who is very seductive and appealing and can mask a lot of right-wing policies in ways that could actually make inroads within the various communities of color. So if the Democrats are not taking very clear stands that make clear that they are for the interest of these communities, then someone like Rubio is a grave threat to be able to make incursions.
Well, and I think something that you mentioned, I mean, I think one of the ways that the Republicans are doing a very good job of preventing individuals from the polls is through the gutting of the Voting Rights Act. And you could actually follow where all of these restrictions have happened to lie along where Latino populations boomed. Most folks don't realize that Shelby County was the 5th largest population boom of Latinos, and unfortunately, it also went after African Americans. But the principle, when you actually look at it, so you have that, but then you also have Republicans doubling down what I call the Karl Rove playbook on steroids. Karl Rove, if folks can remember, in 2004, realized that they didn't need all African American and Latinos and single white women. What they needed was margins. They just needed to skim off the top. And you sort of see a big indention of that with the Koch brothers through the Libra initiative, going in and talking to Latinos about the importance of school vouchers and all of that. But then you also see them making inroads by cozying up and talking about the importance of incarceration. And we don't have those conversations within the progressive movement.
Right, right. And so that's what we have to, it's going to be fascinating to see how they play, because they're making these incursions in that regard. And so when someone says, well, yes, this issue we care about, we do want to talk about, I think we have to think about what that looks like. You know, and the saying from back in the day was, right, you know, no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, just permanent interest. And I think there is a value to that concept.
But they are building the infrastructure that you're basically claiming that the progressives aren't.
Absolutely. And so that's what I'm saying. That's what I mean by conservatives can count. The Koch brothers can count, and they know the growing size of the communities of color, and they're putting major resources into those communities. They're trying to build up Libre. They're trying to partner and build up a brand in these communities. You know, there are, and that while we have to fight back against these voting rights incursions as well, there's a deeper issue around in terms of turning the whole progressive apparatus, all of the data analytics and the research effort to understanding the issue around voter mobilization and turnout. There are 3 million eligible non-voting Latinos in Texas. That's not, and we lose by 600,000 to 900,000 votes there. That's not just an issue of knocking on more doors. There's a cultural issue there. And so we have to train our resources and our firepower understanding that issue and being able to figure out what we need to be able to do to have those people participate. We turn Texas, we turn the whole country, but that's not the top priority of the progressive movement.
We did a lot of work in Texas in 2012, and one of the pieces that we did was just get out the vote efforts. And one thing that we found was that two things. One is that we started discovering that right before it came time to vote, they had sent in the National Guard right by the border. And so and it was because on the auspices of this mass influx of individuals, and they were trying to keep folks safe. So one of the things that we learned was that people were just afraid to go outside. They didn't want to be rounded up. Even American citizens didn't want to be rounded up or racially profiled. Most people don't know that in Texas and as well in California, you basically have two borders. So you basically have the border with Mexico, and then you actually have another checkpoint that you can't go through. And imagine living under that you're constantly questioned if you're American enough. So that's one. And the other we found doing the work was that people didn't know what to bring to the polls. So most robocalls in Texas last at best 25 seconds. Those are the automatic phone calls. We were talking to voters bilingually, and we found that people would stay on the phone 6 to 7 minutes. But it was because they were trying to figure out the process. So it speaks to your point of the lack of education that we need to do. How can we combat that? Like, how can we have a massive movement that actually educates people on the process itself to make it less scary?
Well, I guess where the resource allocation plays itself in. That's why I'm saying we have to look at actually moving hundreds of millions of dollars, not the 5 or 10 or what we actually have been doing and thinking that we're actually doing something. Why isn't there a civic engagement, not even talking about partisan, why isn't there a civic engagement staff person in like every church or every faith-based institution, every community-based institution where people come through around to get social services, that there's a person whose job it is to make sure everyone is registered and to make sure everybody knows when the next election is going to take place. That level of infrastructure would actually go a long way towards addressing that. But that's not how we think, and that's not how we move our money right now.
Right. Well, and again, one of the biggest, I mean, we focus on American Latino young people, recognizing that they'll explain stuff to their parents. They do historically. But when I came to this country, I was 4 years old. I got my civic education from schools, and then I would go home and watch television in the three stations that there were. I'm really dating myself, and I watched Looney Tunes. That also educated me on what it meant to be American. So how do we tap our teachers? How do we tap even industry? Because we are increasingly segregated in the media that we consume, in the schools that teach us, that we're missing these basic principles of democracy building.
Right. Well, the schools is a great example, right? It's another example where there could be large-scale civic engagement and education in a nonpartisan fashion, but in a situation where there's so many of the young under 18-year-olds are people of color that will contribute towards the political transformation ultimately. So it's not that, I mean, I was on a school board for 8 years. It shouldn't be that difficult for every high school senior to get a voter registration card. Right, and so that should just be built into the actual operation of what we're actually doing. But again, that's not a priority, but that should become like a demand of the progressive movement. And then school boards across the country should be able to actually move that forward, which would be a significant quantitative and qualitative step.
Well, and one of the things that we've been trying to work on right now with the administration is how do we digitize the federal form? So the federal form is a paper form that basically all 50 states accept it because it was born out of the Pentagon because they wanted to make sure that recruits could basically vote anywhere. So one of the things that we're trying to do is digitize the federal form. Do you think that there's great hope in increased participation in places such as California and Oregon, where now it's universal, like you're automatically registered to vote?
Yeah, well, we've already seen that. And so I think this issue around using the digital tools is an example, right? So we fought, and again, we had to fight against Democrats to get this in place, but we finally got...
They weren't happy with the redistricting in California.
They weren't happy with redistricting. They're comfortable with the rules as they are, which is how they get elected. But we got online voter registration put in place in California in 2012. Within 6 weeks, 800,000 people had registered to vote through that tool. And so for all the talk about fraud and this and that, you know, you take your credit card, you can go to any store in any place in the country and they'll take your card and have a reasonable level of clarity around who you are. So why can't we have that level of technological capacity around voting as well? So online voter registration, universal registration. I mean, fundamentally, this is where I think the progressive movement needs to lift this issue up, is are we going to engage the debate on, do we think everybody should vote or not? Rather than, oh, there's fraud going on over here. We should put them on the defensive. This is a democracy.
And there isn't fraud. I mean, that's what they've been able to demonstrate.
Oh, absolutely. It's like no fraud. And so, but we're not pushing that issue in terms of, you know, let's do it on the American values. This is, you know, democracy. Don't you want everybody to participate in it? If we want everyone to participate, it's actually not that difficult to make it happen.
That's terrific. So this has been incredibly enlightening. I know that we have some time for questions, so I want to go ahead and open up for questions. Is there a mic? So if you could just state your name and your organization, that would be great. Thank you.
I am John Taylor. I'm with the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. First off, thank you for your remarks. I'm looking forward to reading your book. I want to ask a question without it sound like I'm challenging you, because I read a lot on this topic, including from also from the Center for American Progress, Rui Teixeira, Joan Walsh, What's the Matter with White People, Jane Mayer, who just came up with a book, and it's all about the money politics. I think I have the name of it wrong, but a lot of other stuff on this. And one of the things that I'm looking at is, have progressives really been speaking to the white majority at all? You start with the premise that we, and by the way, I'm a progressive in case there's any doubt about it, in spite of my question. I'm wondering if, when you consider, is there a presumption in your remarks that if we just got all these minorities to vote more, we would win all the elections? And when you consider that George Bush got 47% of the Latino vote in his second election, Barack Obama got more white votes than Bill Clinton, Al Gore, or John Kerry, and in his first election. Like you say, then there was a propaganda campaign for 4 years, which changed things. I'm wondering whether it's not either or, but rather it's a mixture of how we appeal to good-hearted, perhaps they aren't as progressive as we are, but they believe in fairness. And there's polls that really support that notion that there's a big group out there like that. And there are 10 million poor African Americans, 13 million poor Hispanics in the country, 20 million poor whites and of the 20 million poor whites, 9 out of 10 don't vote. And yet they should relate more to what the struggle is for underserved people in this country than any other segment of the white population. So are we really being, I'm sorry for the long-winded question, I just didn't know how to frame this in any other way, but are we being as smart as we possibly can as a progressive community if we're not really continuing to target and talk to the whites who ought to be voting progressively? And by the way, it's not like the conservatives are sitting on the sideline not paying attention to what's going on. Which party has 2 Latino candidates, 1 African American and 1 woman? It's not the progressives.
Right.
But I think we talked a little bit about, right, how basically some of the Republicans are seeing a way to siphon off.
Right, and to be clear, I am saying that there is a new American majority that consists of progressive whites and progressive people of color. And there's always been a consistent percentage of the white population who has sided with people of color. And then now there are so many people of color that percentage can be part of a majority. So I'm making that point. I do feel like in an election where you have limited time and limited resources, I would rather spend the $19 million in North Carolina hiring people from the communities of color to go out and do voter registration work than doing negative ads. But then when we win, we govern in a way that actually makes those people's lives better, such as with Obamacare. They may have hated the president, they may have hated be part of that whole operation, but they're getting health care and their lives are actually getting better. So we govern in a way that actually makes people's lives better, and hopefully some of them will come over towards us politically.
Right.
Hi, Irene Natividad. Thank you for, shedding light on the potential of the people of color vote. But as you well know, none of those groups are monolithic. A Puerto Riqueño is not the same as Dominicano and Cubano. And in the Asian community, a Filipino is not the same as a Viet, it's not the same as a Lao. So the investment you're talking about is actually pretty massive that needs to get done. But that aside, that's more of a comment. My question is this: did you look at gender as a factor? Because if you were to look at this current race on the Democratic side, white women split evenly between Bernie Sanders and Hillary. It's the women of color who are more overwhelmingly for her. And I saw this in particular in '08 in Las Vegas when the culinary trade union, endorsed Obama, but it was the women of color who went and caucused for Hillary. So don't you think that in terms of investment, investing in the women in those communities actually can yield even more in terms of realizing our potential?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think those numbers are correct. You do see within the various communities that the women, particularly the women of color, have played a very significant and strategic role within that. In terms of the book, I mean, I really consciously, I feel like if you want to understand, the health and the challenges to health, that heart disease needs its own treatment and cancer needs its own treatment. And so I felt like race needed a specific treatment and that the context of the history of this country, and that was the book that I felt equipped to write. I actually don't think I'm the best person to write a book in terms of the gender issues, but and I think it needs its own distinct treatment in that regard. So I think that it does play itself out, and it plays itself out in significant ways, and that has to be fully incorporated. But I wanted to honor that issue by not minimizing it with insufficient treatment.
But I do think that there's a pathway to create sort of infrastructure building for women of color. In 2012, you had Latinas 18 to 29 were the second largest voters for President Obama, and it was because at the state level you had so many issues when it came to choice, and which makes sense because the average Latino voter is 27 years old. They're defining their future and their families, whereas the average white voter is 42. I consider them the nostalgic voter. So I think there is a way to recognize the leadership within and influence of women of color within the household and the movement, and create specific targeting for that.
You. Good afternoon. My name is Peggy Seats. I'm with the Washington Interdependence Council. Of course, we're advocates of interdependence. My question is, would you consider an answer that would incorporate these facts when you get that common remark from Europeans saying that I can't help it, don't blame me because I'm white? I think that a good response to that is, don't blame me because I'm black. Don't blame me because I was stolen from my native country and brought here and worked for hundreds of years as a slave, and that have fewer access to the privileges of an American citizenship than anybody here, and are still victims of modern day slavery.
Yeah, no, I absolutely think we have to take this whole conversation about inequality to a deeper level that gets at these different issues. And that was what was helpful to me in terms of thinking through how to articulate it in the book, is that there are reasons we have this inequality, and they're very historical and intentional reasons, and that has to be part of the conversation so we get out of this blaming poor people for poverty piece, which is kind of the current narrative. And we get into that, we will start to understand the history of the country and why a lot of these inequalities exist.
Thank you. My name is Walter Tejada. I am with the Virginia Latino Leaders Council, which focuses on civic engagement in Virginia, and affiliated with a number of other organizations. And this year, we're focusing a lot on the election for obvious reasons, and I want to specifically zero in on the Latino vote. With 27,300,000 eligible Latino voters in the country today, and only about, I think, 11 million voted in the last presidential election. What would it take specifically? And it's hard to, get to one group and all, but in the campaign, you have to have broad issues that people can identify with one or the other, not 100%, but, and so on. What are the specific motivating factors you think would motivate Latinos to come out? We've had, since the last election, 3 million new young Latinos who've turned 18 or more and are eligible to vote, and have the lowest number of participation in coming out and voting. And what would it take? Is getting to the point where not having having a Latino name alone isn't enough. Like, for example, I don't know, like Cruz or Rubio. That's just not going to be enough. What are the specifics that you think, one or two? And there's some obvious, and you think, but it's not immigration alone. And that is a significant subject. And a vast majority of Latinos absolutely want to make sure that we fight for immigration reform and justice for workers, and that are actually paying, for example, into Social Security benefits, subsidizing those who are reaping the benefits without many of them documented actually taking on those benefits themselves. And that's something that people don't see. So what do you think are some of the specifics that would motivate people beyond some of the rhetoric and some of the issues, and not just having a Latino last name?
Well, that's Maria Teresa's life's work, so I will tread on this topic lightly. So I think someone is speaking explicitly and unapologetically to the issues, right? And so in addition to immigration, which I think we should be more unapologetic and forceful about as an issue, I think that will have some level of resonance. And interestingly, George Bush ran this commercial in 2004 it's in Spanish, and it talks about the histories of immigration in ways that it's actually much more nuanced and insightful than a lot of the Democrats actually do. So we have to speak to this issue, speak to the fact that a lot of the southwest of this country used to be part of Mexico, and that's not irrelevant to this whole conversation that we actually have here. But then moving on to the issues of equality, and so taking this equality issue to a deeper level than the way it's currently talked about, there's the profound racial wealth gap between Latinos and whites as well. Right, and so then that's another piece around. I think that, and I'd like to move the discussion to the issue around income inequality to wealth inequality, and promoting a wealth tax. And actually is another way to bring major resources into the country. So those are like some particular pieces. And then the last thing is how the campaigns run. We need to, again, move many millions of dollars, hire staff from these communities to partner with organizations such as Voto Latino to do this kind of work. People who from those communities know the people communicating with their friends and neighbors and family members.
And I would just add that you mentioned something that I think that we're finally having a conversation around, that we know 50% of the Latino vote is being moved by immigration, but there's clearly something out there that no one's tapping and no one's actually doing research. Just a really interesting fact, in the 2010 census, Voto Latino partnered with the Census Bureau, and we were in 3 different areas. We were in California, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Albany. And the goal was basically to get as many people that were English dominant to participate in the work, to basically to fill out their census form. We saw basically, and all we did was we partnered with Telemundo and Univision. They did the Spanish, and we basically targeted the children in English. The goal was to get them to 70% participation. We saw 73% and 74%. Besides that, when the census actually did the work and identified who was filling out the census form, in fact, you saw more Spanish-dominant Latinos filling out the census form than English-dominant Latinos. And that's because Telemundo and Univision were partnered, and Telemundo partnered so deeply that they even had a poll worker in one of their telenovelas, right? So we take for granted that the American Latino, the growing American Latino, the young people that you're talking about are English dominant. Who's talking to them? And I think that's one of the strategies that we have to continue recognizing, that they are English dominant, sharing information for their parents, but we're not investing in that group of Americans. The gentleman back here, please. Up more. Right here on the side. Right there. You got it. Hotter.
Hi. My name is Mike Golish. I agree with your point about the electorate changing, but I'd like you to address what is the situation with the people that actually finance these campaigns, who put up most of the money. My guess is the demographics of that is still overwhelmingly people that make more than a couple $100,000 or millions of dollars, and don't they have a lot of say in who the candidates are, more than the electorate who's actually going to elect them in the end of the day?
Well, yes and no. Bernie Sanders has proved you can democratize fundraising.
Obama did too, right?
In the internet
Obama.
era, yes, Obama did as well. And so that there are, I believe it's 12 million people of color who have a $100,000 a year income, and so we're talking about small level contributions, stitching that together. So the capacity exists to transform actually the campaign finance system. It is true that the major, particularly with the whole Citizens United and the 7-8 figure contributions people are making there. But I mean, look at Jeb Bush's piece. Raised $100 million and got 3% of the vote yesterday. So it's not just an issue around where the finances come from. So
We have time for one more question. The young lady in the back.
Hi, my name is Christina Sansoon, and I'm with SEIU, but I just came from Texas, where I was running field campaigns with Workers' Defense Action Fund in the last election cycle. And my question is about cultural shift on 2 levels. You know, I don't believe demographics are destiny, or Texas would be a very different place than it is now. And the culture shift of really changing Latinos' participation in the electoral process. When you don't have friends or family that vote, it's very hard to change that. It's not just about people knocking on your doors or seeing ads and commercials. And then the second part of that question is about cultural shift, is how do we get people to have that sense in their community that the electoral process is important, but also that the Latino community is not monolithic. And that there needs to be a culture shift for the community about what it means to be Latino, because there's not necessarily in the Latino community's mind a shared experience oftentimes, or a shared motivation to participate in our electoral process. Most Latinos identify first by their nation of origin or by some other sense, but many do not identify in that sense. So I think that that's a big challenge, is how do we shift culturally how people participate in the electoral process, and also how people identify so that they can feel motivated and own the issues and own the work being done in the community.
yeah, and I don't have the answer to the question. What I am pushing the movement to do is to focus on that question. And so I've actually come to believe, and because of the work of people in Texas, the feedback that the thing that I've heard, again, it's not just an incremental mechanical issue that we have to change. It is a culture shift. So we have to be looking more in the world of behavioral science How do you change culture? How do you change mass behavior? And so what I'm trying to push the movement to do is there's all this talk about, the technological tools and data modeling and analysis and all of the tech bells and whistles that are applied to politics. Though that firepower and those resources need to be trained on the question of how do we bring about this cultural shift, and how do we bring about and draw from the world of behavioral science around being able to how to be able to transform how a whole grouping of people participates within our democracy. And that's a large-scale proposition. It's focus groups. It's the best academics who are thinking about this. It's surveys and research. That's the shift that I want us to occur, at least focused on that question, and then we can answer the question. As I've told all of my friends who do work in Texas, is once we turn Texas, I can retire. Right? So, right.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for the conversation. Thank you. And thanks again to the Center for American Progress. And don't forget to pick up the book back there, correct? There, are you going to be signing
yeah, we
them?
have copies of the book. I have a pen that a friend of mine took. So yeah, today's the launch day. Spread the word. So when you're getting this off to a big start, a strong start, it'll be helpful to get this message to have more momentum and impact out there. And thank you all for coming.
No, thank you. So sign mine first before everybody else.